Thanks so much for the introductions, Meredith. Just real quick, I hope that folks can hear me okay. Meredith, can you confirm that for me? Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, you are coming in just fine.
Great, wonderful.
Yep.
Again, thanks so much for the introductions. Myself and Melissa are really happy to be presenting to this group. We hope that you find this information really helpful. As Meredith said, if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we will try and address them as we move along, but if not, we will get to them at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to kick this over to Melissa Burns, and she will walk through the first portion of this presentation.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm just going to forge ahead and give me a shout if anyone's having problems hearing me. So as Janice said, we're very excited to be talking with you today and want to thank you for sharing your lunch break with us. We're excited to be giving this presentation in this format for the first time. We've built a series of interactive questions into the presentation in an effort to keep you engaged and to facilitate a useful and informative question and answer session at the end of the talk. When we ask a question, as they've already mentioned, go ahead and type that into the dialog box, and then we'll get to it if there's a natural part in the discussion where it comes up, or we'll address it at the end. And to get started with this concept right away, we'd like you guys to please provide a brief explanation of the type of work that you do. That'll help us get a better idea of the types of projects you're doing on the ground. The introductory questionnaire that was put up and has since disappeared said the top 3 responses, professions of the participants were arborist, urban forester, and then state agencies. So if you could kind of be more broad in the type of your work, especially for you state agency folks, that'd be fantastic. Okay, let's see. Oh, just trying. Okay, advancing the slide there. So our goal today for this talk is to provide you an explanation of the laws protecting birds in our country and to teach you how to plan and implement your projects in a way that is most protective of most birds most of the time. So as a representative for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the agency with enforcement authority for these laws, I'll be discussing the federal regulations protecting the birds in our country. This discussion is going to include a definition and explaining the concept of take. You're going to hear that a lot, and we'll get to it shortly. And there's also going to be an explanation of legal issues surrounding the destruction of nests. Then Janice is going to lead the discussion of potential project impacts to birds and how you can avoid and minimize those impacts. She will present case studies based on the types of projects encountered during her work as an environmental consultant to demonstrate the issues that regularly arise when implementing projects on the ground. So, why should all of us care about birds? Birds serve as biological indicators and can be used to monitor the health of the environment or an ecosystem. In fact, birds have been used as bioindicators in several pollution events in human history, including the proliferation of DDT in our environment, large oil spills, and pollution derived from mining activities. Birds are regularly used in contamination studies and to assess the health of our wetlands. Birds also play very important ecological service roles. They serve as pest control, both for rodents and pests, as you're aware of from your work. They also help disperse seeds and are pollinators. In the U.S. alone, there are tens of millions of bird watchers, and they spend upwards of $20 billion per year on birdseed, travel, and other associated birding paraphernalia. This growing industry has created a trend throughout the world among bird tour operators to practice sustainable and socially responsible ecotourism. So, birding has direct ties to conservation of habitat and conservation of species. Hunting is another economic force for conservation. A national recreation report by the service estimated the economic contribution of migratory bird hunting in 2011 alone contributed $7.5 billion to our economy. These expenditures create jobs, generate taxes, and make up major sources of wildlife conservation funding. Another thing to be aware of is the major cost associated with conservation. When species are listed under the Endangered Species Act, there is a foregone economic loss of opportunity due to restrictions on the use of private property, designations of protected habitat, and restrictions of numerous types of activities. Preventing species from the need to be listed has its own economic value. So why we care about birds, and when I say we, I mean myself as a federal biologist and Janice and her work as an environmental consultant. There are 3 federal regulations protecting birds in the U.S., and their combined power protects most species in our country. Later in the talk, Janice is going to elaborate more on species that aren't covered, but right now, let's just talk about these 3 laws. So the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, protects animals at risk of becoming endangered or extinct throughout all or parts of their range, and provides listed species with special protections. If you're doing work in areas with habitat for migratory birds, you should be aware of the listed species in your area as a best management practice. So while you won't be likely encounter these listed species, you should be aware of ones that could occur in your area for management purposes. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, or the Eagle Act, provides very specific protections to bald and golden eagles, both of which occur in Utah, which is where we're giving this presentation from. If you conduct work within 1 mile of nest, roosting, or winter congregation areas for eagles, you should coordinate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that your activities are within the law and will not impact these species. So the third bullet, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA as I'll call it throughout the rest of the conversation, is presented here in bold because it's the focus of today's talk. So while the average person is unlikely to encounter an endangered species or something as iconic as an eagle in the course of their day-to-day work, we all see migratory birds every day. Also, I want you to be aware that throughout this presentation that our general discussion of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and its protections don't apply to eagles or listed species. Also, you should be aware that MBTA is a strict liability law. This means that you don't have to know about the law to get in trouble for breaking it. So for our first interactive question, we just like to kind of take a poll on how many of you folks are already aware of MBTA in your work. So let's delve a little bit further into MBTA and the prohibitions of the Act. MBTA protects over 1,000 species in the United States. I think the number right now is 1,007, but it goes up or down depending on when bird species are added to or removed from the Endangered Species Act. Prohibitions of MBTA. MBTA, it's illegal to take, kill, or possess migratory birds. That means parts of the birds themselves, their nest, or their eggs. So what is take? It's further defined as any attempt at hunting, pursuing, wounding, killing, possessing, or transporting any migratory bird, nest, egg, or their parts. So the prohibitions that apply to most folks on the call are going to be wounding, killing, and also possessing, and we'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. We really want you to be aware that most of the impacts under MBTA, the most take that occurring is really happening to nestling birds. Adult birds are able to fly away and avoid danger in many situations. Eggs and nestlings are not able to do that. So when project impacts occur, they're unable to remove themselves from the situation, are wounded or killed in the process. So a little bit more about nest destruction. And this comes up a lot. There's an empty nest and on a branch. You need to cut down the branch. Is that a legal thing for you to do or not? So there's no prohibition of nest destruction under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And to be clear, this means a nest without eggs or without dependent young. And here is a warning to make it very clear. Nest destruction resulting in take, so that means dead birds or cracked eggs, is illegal and prosecutable by law. So just want to let that sink in, because I think that these are the issues where most of us are coming in on the wrong side of MBTA. And here's where I wanted to make the point about the prohibition of possession. Nests of migratory birds are protected from possession, so if you're in the process of destroying a nest, it is very important that you don't take it home or have it in your hands or any of those things. It's our recommendation when we're coordinating with folks in these situations that they actually bury a nest that's been removed on site, and that will remove you from any liability of possession of a nest. It's also important to be aware of the special cases involving nest destruction. It is strictly prohibited to remove the nest of an eagle without a special permit. That's beyond the scope of this conversation, but I'd be happy to get into more details during the discussion portion of this conversation if anyone's interested. Removal of nest of listed species or species protected under the Endangered Species Act is also strictly prohibited and requires special coordination or permits from the service. There are also species that, because of their biology and life history characteristics, have an elevated risk of destruction. So, for example, colonial nesters or ground nesters, they're at more risk of take, so killing of young or eggs if birds nesting in colonies. For example, swallows with colonial nest under a bridge, one of those cavities may be inactive, and in the process of knocking it down, you could destroy a nest that actually has eggs inside of it. So be particularly aware of those issues when you're working with these species. So here's our first case study. We're kind of just introducing this information to introduce the ideas and issues that are going to be discussed in future slides. So we're just posing this as an example of an issue that could come up. A local government receives a $150,000 grant for restoration along a portion of a riverside park with degraded vegetation and trees. An objective for this grant funding was to remove invasive and noxious species and plant native and wildlife-friendly trees and shrubs as a replacement. The officials prepared a tree removal plan. Tree removal began in May and was scheduled to be complete in June. Nearby residents noticed trees with birds' nests were being cut down and called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to voice their concerns. The local government was informed that they were not in compliance with the MBTA. So the government was informed that they cannot take birds. And so what options did the local government have? So this is an example, but Janice and I used this as an example for a situation that really happened and that brought us together as a partnership for this outreach effort. So what we did was develop this brochure entitled Our Shared Responsibilities in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and using that brochure we've developed this presentation as well to help inform people of the law of Migratory Bird Treaty Act and to provide planning in the form of avoidance and minimization measures that people doing work on the ground can employ to avoid impacts to these species. We've also worked to provide the contacts and enable communication between partners, groups, and agencies doing work on the ground so you know who to call when these problems come up. And at this point, I'm going to pass the headset back over to Janice, and she's going to walk you through the rest of the discussion.
So let's take a step back and talk about bird biology as it relates to MBTA, so we have a clear understanding of some of the impacts and issues that we're talking about here. So here in Utah, I know that a lot of you are calling in from different states, but here in Utah we've got about 400 bird species. 247 of those bird species are known to be regular breeders in the state. Not all of those 247 bird species that breed here are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, however, most of them are. Specifically, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which Melissa touched upon, it protects native migratory species. So with very few exceptions, this includes most birds. The only birds it doesn't include are non-native species, so European starlings, house sparrows are not included. So any non-native species is not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as many upland game birds are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So examples of these would be quail, grouse, wild turkey. It is important to note, though, that one cannot just go take or shoot a quail, wild turkey, other upland species. The one's respective state issues permits, i.e. hunting permits, to take those species. So they're covered under separate regulations. Just to make sure this point is clear, most issues with noncompliance in Migratory Bird Treaty Act involve impacts to nesting birds. And why is that? And that's because the nesting birds, this is a sensitive time during their biology when they cannot move away. So birds nest in just about any habitat, whether it's natural or man-made. And in most cases, most of our songbirds, many of our birds, they leave for the winter, as I'm sure most of us all know, and they come back to their breeding grounds or summer habitats in order to breed. Some birds we might see year-round. Some birds are residents, like a lot of folks have chickadees that are residents, maybe at their feeders or in their neighborhoods. Other birds like robins we see year-round. However, some of the robins we see may be migrants from another area, whereas the robins that you have in the summertime are actually traveling south during the winter. So where are you going to find bird nests? Birds, like I said, can nest really anywhere. We usually expect birds to be in a lot of natural settings. So, your classic nest would be a cup-shaped nest in a tree branch. But birds can also nest in a lot of other places, and they're often very well hidden and they're hard to find. Some birds will nest on the ground. If folks are familiar with killdeer, which is a plover-like bird, they nest right on the ground in gravel areas, a lot of times in parking lots. One natural setting that a lot of birds will use that folks may not recognize is dead trees or snags. Cavities in dead trees are really important to a lot of birds. A lot of woodpeckers and swallows will use those cavities. And a lot of times in folks' day-to-day work, we're coming across perhaps dead trees that are aesthetically not pleasing and we'd like to remove them. And those can be really important bird habitats. As far as urban nesting sites, high-rise buildings, we've got a lot of falcons and raptors that are nesting in urban areas now. Chimneys are common for swallows. Utility poles, we've got all sorts of things from ravens to magpies will use utility poles. Building eaves, culverts, bridges. So the peak breeding season when most birds breed is April through July. This is, there is some wiggle room here depending on the season and also where you live, so check in with your local Fish and Wildlife Service coordinator on that. But what the peak breeding season means is that most of the birds that are protected by Migratory Bird Treaty Act are going to be, this is when they are going to be breeding. The entire breeding season, which captures the breeding activity of all birds, including raptors and eagles, is January through August. Raptors and eagles breed a lot earlier than our songbirds, and they also stay on the nest a lot longer. So that's why we have a date of January through August that includes the entire breeding season. So how are birds impacted? Again, our biggest time when we are impacting birds is when birds are breeding and they are really stuck on the nest. Tree trimming, pruning, cutting down live or dead vegetation. As I mentioned, those dead vegetation can be really important habitats for breeding birds. Using mowing machines, lawnmowers, driving over any vegetation. Like I said, killdeer will nest right on the ground in gravel areas, so it's really important to be careful about that. Really any ground disturbance, prescribed burns, stream or habitat enhancement. Just because you have a project that is, it has a net benefit to birds, if it's done during an improper season, like breeding season, it can really have some pretty bad impacts on birds. Also invasive species management, like doing Phragmites removal, things like that. If that's during the breeding season, you can really impact a lot of breeding birds. So folks here, can you think of some, common or seasonal projects or tasks that you're involved with that could impact birds? If you have a couple 1 to 2 word responses, please feel free to type those in. So the first way to avoid impacting our migratory bird species is to conduct your project when the birds aren't breeding. And that's kind of a no-brainer thing, but it's really the most easy way to protect our migratory birds. This presentation isn't, the title is how to do your sort of tree trimming and pruning and stuff like that. And we're not going to offer specific recommendations on, oh, cut this type of tree and not this tree, but really to talk about our avoidance and minimization. So let's walk you through this calendar right here. If possible, the best way to avoid birds is we've got the calendar January through December, and we know that our birds, the entire nesting season is January through August, and our peak nesting season is April through July. So first, we're going to plan to avoid our projects from April to July. And as best we can, we're going to plan to avoid our projects January through August. The best time to implement our projects, if you think they may have impacts on birds, is September through December. So that calendar is not suitable for everyone's project. It's great to protect birds, but we have a lot of other things to think about with our projects. One of them is being, funding schedules and when our budgets are coming in, when we can staff projects. So how can we minimize our impacts to birds? One of the things that we can do is, number one, first, really try and focus on avoiding that peak season. Again, that is our April through July. That's when we are going to be able to avoid most of our birds, our songbirds, a lot of the birds are migrating in. The birds that we're not going to be able to avoid, the raptors and eagles, are going to be that January to March and then that month of August. So, for example, if we are going to try to minimize and we know that we've got a project where we say it's a landscaping type project and we are going to be taking out a bunch of shrubs and replacing them with something new. You know that you're wanting to do that shrub removal in May. One of the things, and for whatever reason you can't avoid that, one of the things you can do is you can do the habitat removal part before the birds show up. So again, if you can do the habitat removal part maybe in the winter or in the early part of the spring, you can avoid a lot of impacts. So the birds will show up, the habitat's mostly gone, and you don't have to worry about them setting up nests. And then when you remove shrubs in the month of, say, May, you'll be better off for it. Another thing to do is, similarly, if you have a project, you can do surveys for active nests and work around them. This is something that usually you'll bring in a trained professional to help with, such as a consultant. The Fish and Wildlife Service is going to want to see that there is a professional biologist doing these type of surveys. So say you have a parcel of land, again, you need to do some kind of habitat altering project. You'll hire someone, you're not going to have your bulldozer driver doing this. Hire someone to do sort of a clearance survey for any active nests. Usually these need to be done within a few days before the actual habitat altering is going to be done, so that, if you're doing them too early, a bird could set up shop while before you have time to cut the vegetation down. So what you do is a biologist would go out there and say, hey, listen, we've got a nest over here in this corner of the project. So what the Fish and Wildlife Service will recommend doing is setting up a buffer around that nest until the young have fledged and it's safe to proceed and then you will be in compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So what if there really isn't an approach that works for your project? Say, again, there's circumstances that come up where you have to get in there during the peak breeding season and you're a little bit worried about the types of minimization things. Coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They are there for your help. They can give you other methods to minimize impacts to birds from your project, and it's really best to just stay in close touch with them. Again, to touch on this, we know that there's special management issues related to raptors. Melissa said, for the most part, folks may not be coming in touch with raptors and eagles in the day-to-day, but there are a few raptor species that are pretty common even in suburban and urban areas. Two of those would be like American kestrel. I don't know if folks see those often, and also screech owls. Here we've got the western screech owl in Utah, and they will readily nest in suburban and urban areas. Raptors, as you may know, they've got really long lifespans and they're very slow to reproduce. So they've got specific habitat requirements and they are more sensitive to disturbance. And again, if you have specific questions about raptors, if you think you may be impacting raptors, consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, bald eagles, because they are protected under a separate federal law, if you believe that you may be impacting eagles, again, I can't repeat this enough, just consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're happy to also address specific questions at the end of this presentation. One thing that is interesting to know is that for eagles, there are actually permits issued for incidental take under special circumstances. This would be similar to an incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act. Again, this probably is not something that folks will come across in their day-to-day. So let's walk through sort of a case study here. So pretend you are a utility company and you need to maintain an open right-of-way that's free of trees and shrubs. The vegetation in this region, so where this project is, this example project, say it needs to be cut back every about 2 to 3 years to keep it low and shrubby so you don't have branches growing into the transmission corridor. Let's say that this corridor is 40 miles long. It's got pretty significant winters, and it's got limited access points. So, when we're thinking about avoidance planning, this utility company, they plan to avoid all birds, not just the peak season, but all birds. They didn't want to impact any raptors, so they have planned to do all their vegetation clearing from September to January. So like I said, this project happens to be in an area that gets a lot of snowfall, and they can generally get most of their work done in September and October before the snow comes. For this project, if they can't complete all the work in the allotted season along that 40-mile corridor, they can think about splitting the management between years. So in year 1, they're going to do their vegetation management along half of the corridor in year 1 and the half they'll do in year 2. So that kind of splits up the stress and the worry of getting all your vegetation clearing in one season if you can kind of split it up. And then you still got enough time, say the month of September and October, to complete that. So using this method, you're in full compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. No birds, including raptors or eagles, are going to be directly impacted by this vegetation removal. So let's say it is the end of September, and as you're working with your subcontractor that's doing the actual tree clearing, for some reason they go out of business, they go into bankruptcy, and they are no longer able to complete the work. And coincidentally, maybe there's another pipeline in the area that has literally all the other contractors booked, and you're not able to finish the vegetation clearing that you had anticipated in that year. So what are you going to do? You're worried about now that you're going to have spillover into the bird nesting season. So the utility company can plan to finish their vegetation management early the next spring when a contractor does free up. So if they're going to do their vegetation clearing, it's going to start running into that entire nesting season when you could have raptors showing up. So one thing that this utility company will do is that they're going to work with the contracted biologist to do a quick survey along that corridor to make sure that there are no active raptor nests. Again, because it's early enough in the year, we don't need to worry about any passerines. They're not nesting yet. So if there are any active raptor nests, we'll put a buffer around them as to not disturb them, and we'll conduct the vegetation management in other areas. So here's another study, and this one, I don't know if folks saw this in the news. This one got a lot of press, especially out here in the West. So here's a few headlines. Wildlife officials investigate after tree trimmers injure 5 young birds. Birds leave nest involuntary, and Oakland fumes. This is my favorite one. Baby birds fed into wood chipper. It's like a little bit of a Fargo type of thing there. Baby herons mangled in wood chipper in Oakland, critics say. And the landscaper may face federal charges for injuring birds outside of Oakland post office. So what happened in this situation was, this was in Oakland, California. There was a tree, as I understand, there was a tree that was overhanging a parking area that was used by the U.S. Postal Service to park their fleet vehicles. And some, these were black-crowned night herons, took up residence in this tree. Not only were they roosting there, so spending time there, but they also had nests in there as well. So the Postal Service was getting pretty peeved because, as you can imagine, these birds were making a huge mess over their fleet vehicles. They hired a tree trimmer to come and trim down the trees to get the birds to move away. So I'm not sure if the Postal Service just kind of thought the birds were roosting there and maybe didn't have nest, or they just really wanted the situation to go away. So a tree trimmer was hired. He came in, he started trimming down these branches, and as you can see, these nestlings are pretty big, so it was pretty easy to see, and it literally started raining down birds. And this being an urban corridor, folks saw what was happening and they right away alerted the officials. So what ended up happening is there was, I believe, a lot of outcry over this, but the Postal Service that hired the tree trimmer was not being prosecuted by the Fish and Wildlife Service for this. They were going after the tree trimmer, the gentleman that was hired to do the tree trimming and actually the physical act of removing these tree limbs. He ended up not paying any fines on this, but as you can imagine, it was a huge headache, not only for him personally, but his business suffered greatly. People were pretty upset about this. So that's just another point, is it's not only the right thing to do, it's not only the law, but for folks to get involved in a project and to have impacts to migratory birds, and for the public to find out about it, you know, the discourse from that can be pretty significant. It's really bad press. And I think more and more people are becoming more aware of not just the environment, but, you know, specifically birds and the protections for birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And I'm putting this slide up again just to reinforce this, that if you have questions that are specific to your project, again, you know, there's for some reason that you've got a project plan, it's in the middle of breeding season, and you're really worried about your impacts to birds, coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service, whether it's the Utah field office here in West Valley City or your regional office. Well, we've got some slides at the end with some resources so that you can find the representative in your region. So the general Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program website is listed here. And if you would like a link to the brochure that Great Salt Lake Audubon and the Fish and Wildlife Service produced, it is on the Great Salt Lake Audubon website. If you go to greatsaltlakeaudubon.org or just type that into Google, it's on the front page. It's a nice glossy sort of 3-panel document, and it's a summary of a larger 3-page best practices document. So if you want the quick and dirty version of it, please see that that brochure document. But if you'd like the more lengthy, thorough document to help you plan your projects, do see that 3-page best practices document. And again, both of those are on the Audubon website. If folks, we'll have our email address coming up here soon. If folks want to email Melissa or I personally, we are happy to also email you those files. Here in Utah, we have a specific document related to Raptor Protections. This was put out over 10 years ago, but it's got a lot of relevant information. Most folks, even if you're not in Utah, a lot of state fish and game departments, so if you know your state level fish and game department will have these. These are often tailored to folks in private industry, I would say, so utility companies, developers, things like that nature. So with that, we've got plenty of time, which we're glad to have for some discussion. So I see that we've got a lot of questions, and perhaps Meredith can help me can help facilitate some of those. But some things to think about, you know, think about the ways, if you have questions about what projects really conflict with bird breeding season that you'll really have a hard time avoiding. Does your current planning process include measures to avoid or minimize impacts to birds? So if you're going to do a major landscaping project or tree removal project or habitat you know, restoration, are you thinking about impacts to breeding birds and how you're going to fit that into your schedule? Is there easy changes that you can make during project planning or implementation? You know, do you feel like you have enough time to schedule actual project implementation and project work in? So these are some of the things we'd love for you to think about, and please ask us questions.
Thank you so much, ladies. I think a lot of the questions have been answered throughout the presentation, but one that seemed to come back was about hazardous trees specifically, and if there was a imminent safety risk, public safety risk, and there was, say, a kestrel nest inside this snag, it sounds like the best approach would be to wait until that breeding season is over, but if there is a public safety issue, is there something to at least cover the contractor to say either they're going to wait because of the bird, and then if the tree falls, they're not liable, or they're going to somehow deal with the nest or relocate and then take care of the public safety? Is there any kind of case studies on that, or
yeah, I'm going to pass the mic back over
to
Melissa Burns with this. And so again, just to repeat, the question is, what to do if you have a safety issue or a hazardous situation, be it a tree or otherwise. This does come up a lot if there is a bird nesting on a transmission line. I mean, that can be a public hazard as well. But yes, there are things to do, and I'll let Melissa address that.
Okay, thank you, and that is a really good question. So to be clear, anytime there is a human health and safety issue, that is going to take precedent over issues that are protective of wildlife species. With that being said, there's still kind of a stepwise process that you should go through, and the first of those would be, I think, a great example that was used first of all to set the scene a little bit is a hazardous tree removal, or say a nest on a transmission line that's sparking and could potentially cause a fire or an electrical outage. So these are the types of emergency issues that we see most often. So in those cases, it's very important to make a call to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement to let them know what the situation is and say this is a human safety issue and we're going to have to take action. In most cases, we request that you would wait for a call back. However, if it were a true fire issue, I think the prudent thing to do would be to take action and to protect the resources in people's homes from fire, and to go ahead and remove that nest and deal with it afterward. But in most cases, you still coordinate with the service, and then we help you in a stepwise fashion to get that nest taken down, or to get you a permit to take that nest down so you can remove the trouble nest or remove that hazardous limb. So if anybody has follow-ups specific to that, go ahead and type them in, or we can, let's see what other questions are come up. See, Darren just typed, what do we do if we have a killdeer nesting in a ball field? Are we obligated to close the field to play until they leave? That's another really good question. I would follow up with additional questions. So where in proximity to the play is the killdeer nesting? So specifically, if the nest is right in the middle of running from home plate to first base and you could cause that nest to fail or destroy eggs, then you should not be playing in that field. However, killdeer are a pretty tolerant species to disturbance, and if they were, say, 100, 200, 300 feet away from the field, you could probably assume that regular play would not cause major impacts to that nest. We have these types of situations come up when there's multi-million-dollar projects going on the ground. So from a federal perspective, asking folks to move their play, to buffer a nest by 100 feet and move their play to another ball field is a pretty small ask. Sometimes you'll have tens of $1,000s worth of person power and equipment out on the ground waiting to put in a 100-mile pipeline, and we're stopping folks from moving forward with the project to protect a killdeer nest in that situation. So when there are a lot of economic factors at play, and we try to do this as little as possible, but when buffers aren't going to work and work has to move forward, there is the opportunity of working with wildlife rehabbers or other professionals to relocate those nests to protect those resources. But we really do that as a last worst case scenario and rely heavily on the avoidance and minimization measures that Janice and I discussed throughout the previous portions of the presentation to avoid those impacts. So Darren says they're generally nesting near the infield fence. So hopefully that kind of walked you through kind of the options that we would provide. And I think Darren's question also raises an important point, that the point of coordinating with this service is because we can give all these really big generalizations, but a lot of these times it's project specific, species specific, timing specific, and so we don't give wholesale wide-ranging recommendations. We want to talk about case specifics to avoid impacts to that bird or that nest when we get to these specific situations. Let's see. Thanks. Oh, I guess Janice was just scrolling through to see if there were any other outstanding questions that had been entered, but we didn't see any.
You know, I had one other question. This is Meredith, and you mentioned consulting biologists for in that interim where, you know, you might want to do a survey if your project can't be adjusted. Where would someone go to find lists of local consulting biologists, or who does that kind of work?
Where to find lists of consulting biologists or environmental consultants on contract. And since as a representative for a federal agency, I can't give out recommendations for consultants, I'm going to turn that question over to Janice.
You know, I would say that most regions have a number of talented environmental consultants that can help folks with any issues they have with Migratory Bird Treaty Act, whether it's, you know, on the building a house type level all the way up to, you know, a massive pipeline where there'll be federal coordination on migratory bird issues. You know, I wouldn't say that there is necessarily a directory, but, you know, for folks that have a concern, you know, I think one of the best ways is to maybe just ask around a few, if, you know, you're not in the Utah area, just to ask around a few times. You know, some consultants are stronger than others, just like any service. So just to find that someone that will do the best job for you and the best job related to your project. So there's a question where, oh, go ahead.
Just to follow up with that, go ahead, Janice. I was just going to follow up with that to say that a lot of the projects, or a lot of the arborists that I can recognize here on the webinar are probably doing really small scale projects. Is there any kind of community support for these types of surveys, or single tree issues where, you know, they want to have someone come in, but cost is of concern in that, and if people are wanting to do the right thing, but the cost of having a specialist come out is going to be more than the cost of the job itself, are there some support systems in place within the birding community that might be able to help some of these?
What if you've got a really small project? Say you've got like a tree removal thing, and it's going to cost like $5,000 to do this project. It's really small. It'll take a couple hours. And the cost to have a biologist come out and do a clearance survey will probably cost, $1,000 to do a day's of work or something like that. What you need to weigh is that even though you have a small project, if there's a bird in that tree and it's impacted, you're still not in compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And you need to make sure you understand your responsibilities, because even though it is an additional fee, if you are going to do a tree removal during breeding season, is that additional fee to hire a professional biologist to come out and do a quick clearance survey, is that worth being prosecuted under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act? And like I said, it's not just, there's implications for fines, but also, the public perception and the fallout from that can be really significant. So again, even if you have a small project, it is best to try and plan that project so that you can avoid those peak seasons. And I'm not aware of any sort of public service to go out and do sort of one of these clearances, especially if we're talking about a private level project. If this was a public project, there might be some interest. You might be able to drum up some volunteer, but again, that would have to be very well coordinated. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. Great. It's a good question. Thank you. I see that Travis heard the first meadowlark of the year, and that's a good point. I hope that this conversation is well timed. Maybe the timing isn't best for your planning, but birds are showing up right now. We've got owls and raptors and eagles have been sitting on nests for over a month now, in some cases 2 months, and all of our songbirds and other birds are definitely showing up. The reason birds sing is to set up those breeding territories and find mates. So when you hear singing bird, that's a sign that you've potentially got birds breeding around. This is a great question. I actually meant to touch on
about magpies. Some people hate magpies.
They are
they
fully
legally
protected
remove
under the
their
Migratory
nests.
Bird Treaty Act, as are a number of other birds that most folks consider annoying. I don't know if any of you have ever had a woodpecker just tapping on the side of your house and driving you crazy starting at like 3:30 in the morning. You cannot kill that bird. You cannot take that bird's nest out if it has chicks in it. So if you've got a magpie that has already taken up in a tree in your yard and it's got eggs in there, it's nesting, you cannot remove it. Now, if you've got a magpie that has built a nest, but it is the winter time, you can remove that to discourage the bird from nesting there in the breeding season. That is legal, and that's what Melissa was talking about, where if you do that, make sure that the nest has been removed. Don't make that nest part of the decor in your house. Not that you would if you hate magpies, but you're not allowed to be in possession of the nest. And Melissa's got a follow-up on that.
I would just like to add, because of Janice's example of a woodpecker and, if there were lots of magpies or lots of birds causing depredation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, there are permits that exist to deal with these types of economic damage to crops or damage to property. And so those birds, there are permits that exist that you can apply for to remove those birds, those nuisance or depredating species. So we have built a system where there are workarounds to solve problems that exist for a lot of people. And so while Migratory Bird Treaty Act is protecting these species, when there are issues that require, say, removal of an active nest or removal of a nuisance bird, you go through our migratory bird permitting office to legally obtain permits to deal with those issues. So, okay, that was all I had about that. I don't know if there are any other questions from participants.
I think it looks like we've covered most everything, and we will post this webinar on the YouTube link that Megan has put here in the chat pod. So it also then has the links to the brochure that Janice and Melissa referred to and other reference items. Thank you so much, ladies, for the